Guelph. My name is Mark Peralivas. That rhymes with For All of Us, and I'm the People's Party candidate for the October federal election for the Guelph riding. I hope you vote for me. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about protecting Canadians from censorship and discrimination, the People's Party platform on freedom of expression, something that's written into our Constitution. And to introduce it, one of the people who helped write it, Professor Haskell, is tweeting, quote, "Stopping Canada's march towards censorship in its tracks, protecting citizens' right to think differently from others. The People's Party of Canada policy on freedom of expression is now out. It can become a reality. Vote October 21st. At Jordan B. Peterson, at New World Hominin," and that's Lindsay Shepherd, who was at Wilfrid Laurier, and that's where Professor Haskell teaches. So it's interesting that the Wilfrid Laurier situation kind of plays into this fledgling party and this potential new government in October, or potentially new government in October, depending on how Canada votes. I understand, but still. Here's the policy, and I will read it out. Freedom of expression, protecting Canadians from censorship and discrimination. Issue: the rights of Canadians to freely hold and express beliefs are being eroded at an alarming speed under the Trudeau government. Some of its recent decisions even require that Canadians renounce their most deeply held moral convictions and express opinions they disagree with. In 2018, the Liberal government denied summer job funding to organizations, including charities, that would not sign an attestation supporting abortion. It also passed Bill C-16 as part of a trend to force Canadians to express support for the existence of various gender identities beyond the biological categories of male and female, and to use pronouns demanded by those who identify with these other genders. In addition to these assaults on conscience, the government launched a series of regulatory attacks on free speech on the internet and is pressuring social media companies, which are already censoring speech that isn't politically correct, to crack down even more. It is also considering bringing back Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. This hate speech provision was repealed by the Conservative government in 2013 because it was being used arbitrarily to censor statements that offended some people on the internet. In what appears to be a first step towards restricting our rights to criticize some religions, it adopted M103, a motion that condemns religious discrimination but only specifically mentions one religion, Islam, and without defining the term Islamophobia. Finally, on university campuses, a growing number of faculty and administrators, those who should be fighting for open debate of controversial ideas, have become aggressive advocates for censorship. Yeah. Facts, history, and social scientific research show that freedom of conscience and freedom of expression, when maximally protected, advance the intellectual life of a nation, foster greater ideological diversity and societal understanding, and nurture other freedoms necessary for a successful democracy. This is why Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees citizens freedom of conscience and religion, as well as freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. Our plan, what some people find politically incorrect, offensive, or even hateful, cannot serve as the legal basis for discrimination and censorship. Canadians should be able to enjoy maximum freedom of conscience and expression as guaranteed in Section 2 of the Charter. A People's Party government will restrict the definition of hate speech in the Criminal Code to expression which explicitly advocates the use of force against identifiable groups or persons based on protected criteria such as religion, race, ethnicity, sex, or sexual orientation. Repeal any existing legislation or regulation curtailing free speech on the internet and prevent the reinstatement of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. Repeal C-16 and M103. Ensure that Canadians can exercise their freedom of conscience to its fullest extent as it is intended under the Charter and not discriminated against because of their moral convictions. Withhold federal funding from any post-secondary institution shown to be violating the freedom of expression of its students or faculty. So I find that interesting. I'm not going to touch on everything. I'm not going to look at M103, but I am going to look at the history of Section 13. We're going to look at C-16, and not the reason I'm not looking at M103 is it's a motion, not a full law, and I'm glad that we're going to repeal it. I could do a whole video on any one of these things, but I'm just going to touch lightly on a couple, okay? And if you want to do some extra reading, I provide some links. They're all in the description. Everything I talk about links in the description. So first, to kick this all off, Jordan Peterson became quite famous a few years ago because he specifically refused to listen to the Canadian government when they passed C-16.
Bill C-16.
And he said, that was supposed to be loaded, but my browser's being strange. He said, basically, I'm not going to do that. You can't compel speech from me. And the reason that he is saying this is compelled speech, well, he explains it here much better than I can. So I'll let Dr. Peterson, I apologize, lay out the reason this is so controversial and so beyond the pale. This has never happened in the history of our legal structure. And, well, compelled speech, meaning you have to say something because somebody else wants you to, is very difficult, because that gets into what do you believe in your head, right? Like, there are 4 lights. Have you seen Star Trek: The Next Generation? Oh, man. Okay, take it away, Dr. Peterson.
Purported to do nothing but extend human rights provisions to an excluded group, let's say, to the transgender and non-gender binary types. And that was the federal legislation. It also made it a hate crime to discriminate or harass, essentially. So now then the question is, well, what exactly do you mean by discriminate or harass? And why exactly is that a hate crime under the criminal code? Well, there was an answer to that. The answer was, well, this bill will be interpreted in light of the policies generated by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, very large set of policies. Now, the Ontario Human Rights Commission is a radically leftist organization. I think it's the most dangerous organization in Canada, although you could debate that. And they set all sorts of policies about how this legislation was going to be interpreted, and the federal government linked to their website to state that Bill C-16 would be interpreted in light of those guidelines. So I went and read all the policies. Well, one of the policies was that if you didn't use the preferred pronouns of a given group, that you could be charged essentially with a hate crime. And I thought, no,
Which
that's
given group is that? You're talking about transgender people.
Yeah, and so there's all these pronouns that have come up. There's 70 different sets of pronouns approximately to hypothetically describe people who don't fit anywhere on the gender spectrum, which is also something that I don't really understand. I don't understand that conceptually.
We'll come to that. But I just want to hear the story of this bill first.
Okay, so now a person is compelled under Canadian law to use the pronoun of another individual's choice on pain of law. And I thought, well, no, that's not acceptable. It's one thing to put limits on what a person can't say, like say with hate speech laws, which I also don't agree with, by the way, but that's a different argument. I think it's a narrower argument. But to compel me to use a certain content when I'm formulating my thoughts or my actions under threat of legislative action, I thought, no, what's happened there is the government has introduced compelled speech legislation into the private sphere. It's never happened in the history of English common law. And so I said, there's no way I'm abiding by that. I don't care what your damn rationale is. We're compassionate. It's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're playing this radical collectivist left-wing game. You're trying to gain linguistic supremacy in the area of public discourse. You're doing that using compassion as a guise, and you're pulling the wool over people's eyes. And you're not going to do it with me.
If I was sitting here in front...
And I'm going to stop that there. The link is in the description. I think the whole conversation is worthwhile, but I think the interesting point is here. It's weaponization of language. They're hijacking language and thought and saying you must think this way. And there's no other way that you can think. And if you do think another way, well, you, sir, are a hateful person, or madam, are a hateful person and deserve penalty of law, right? You have committed a crime, a hate crime, when it's too muddy for that. And when you have law set out in the framework of our legal system, that is one thing, right? But when you have these quasi-legal systems that are coming up that have certain jurisdictions but can't say you've been charged with a crime but can fine you, that seems problematic, and that's the Ontario Human Rights Tribunals. Very, very problematic. So this whole system is problematic, and it is beyond transgender people. The transgender people are just the transgender pronouns are just the spark, the inciting incident that is the spark that set this whole thing off, because it's not the pronouns that are the problem, it's the compelled speech. And in this conversation, this host asks Dr. Peterson, if I was sitting across from you right now and I preferred to be referred to as a woman instead of a man, would you do that? And Dr. Peterson says, yeah, in an interpersonal way, sure. And then he carries on with the pronouns, Z and Zer, et cetera, and explains his position even further. But it's the hijacking of the way thoughts are formulated that's difficult to get past. It is not the place of the government to make choices like that. And so that is one aspect of C-16, and I'm glad that we have an option to repeal it. Here's the Justice Committee. This is a different issue entirely. The Justice Committee will expunge, this is reported on June 4th, the Christchurch shooter's words after Tory MP read them into record. Now, if you don't know who this is and what this is a Conservative MP on the Justice Committee read into the record the Christchurch manifesto to disprove Faisal Suri's testimony that right-wing extremism leads to shootings like, and Mr. Faisal Suri was using the Quebec massacre as an example, but Mr. Cooper said, here's the Christchurch person, in his own words, he denounces conservatism and says communism is actually what he aligns himself with. We're going to listen to that right after we listen to this Liberal MP, I believe this is Mr. Bossino, but I could be wrong, talk about how beyond the pale Mr. Cooper reading what I just told you into record is. I just think this is incredible. This is further attacking free speech. Mr. Cooper read the truth into the record and said, this witness shouldn't be allowed to make up his own truth. Maybe what he says is true in a certain circumstance, but in this circumstance that matches the circumstances that the witness is saying, it's not true, and here's his own words to prove it. They are saying this is beyond the pale, you can't do this. Here's the Liberal MP.
It wasn't an emotional reaction, it was a strategy. He had the document printed. It's not easy to find that document online. It can take you, you shouldn't be looking for it, but people who try tell me that, look, it's hours and they can't find it. And so we're talking about the ability of people to find heinous comments online in the middle of an online hate story committee. And then when a witness just comes and says, look, the alt-right is a thing, it is sometimes connected to the conservative movement, and then Mr. Cooper uses the manifesto of the Christchurch attacker as a way to defend conservatism, that's beyond the pale. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Now let's hear this beyond the pale attack on the witness or whatever. Here's exactly what happened.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, Mr. Suri, I take great umbrage with your defamatory comments to try to link conservatism with violent and extremist attacks. They have no foundation, they're defamatory, and they diminish your credibility as a witness. And let me, Mr. Chair, read into the record the statement of Brenton Tarrant, who is responsible for the Christchurch massacre. He left a 74-page manifesto in which he stated, conservatism is corporatism in disguise. I want no part of it. The nation with the closest political and social values to my own is the People's Republic of China, close quote. And I certainly wouldn't attempt to link Bernie Sanders to the individual who shot up Republican members of Congress and nearly fatally killed Congressman Scalise. So you should be ashamed. Now, with respect,
At our committee.
So I'm just going to leave it there. You can listen to the whole situation. But that is what he read of the Christchurch manifesto. Now, if you listened to this, which you did because we all just did, only listening to that, you would think that what he read was some kind of hate speech, but it wasn't any kind of hate speech. And they're expunging this from the record. This didn't happen officially. Legally, he didn't say that. Here's the June 4th newspaper, Global News reporting. Global News? Yeah, Global News. It says the House of Commons Justice Committee on Tuesday voted to have the name and words of the man who killed more than 50 Muslims in a double mosque shooting in New Zealand earlier this year expunged from its record. That comes 1 week after Conservative MP Michael Cooper read an excerpt of the shooter's 74-page manifesto into the record during a hearing as part of the committee's study of online hate. Is this the Canada you want to live in? They've misrepresented this in a way that is just ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. What Mr. Cooper did, right or wrong, was read the words of an alt-right mosque shooter who denounced conservatism, directly disproving part of what Mr. Suri was saying. And I think that we can't possibly be that willfully blind, right? We're going to expunge this from the record so it didn't happen. So future generations can see that we didn't read the truth into the record. It's very, very, very strange to watch a government committee behave this way. Going back to 2013, this is the repeal of Section 13, and I know this is a long video. I apologize, but we're going to finish it out. Here we go. A contentious section of the Canadian human rights law, long criticized by free speech advocates as overly restrictive and tantamount to censorship, is gone for good, or until the Liberals get in charge, A private member bill repealing Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, the so-called hate speech provision, passed in the Senate this week. Its passage means the part of Canadian human rights law that permitted rights complaints to the Federal Human Rights Commission for the communication of hate messages by telephone or on the internet will soon be history. I scroll down a little bit. An ecstatic Storseth said the bill, which he says had wide support across ideological lines and diverse religious groups, repeals a flawed piece of legislation, and he called Canada's human rights tribunals a quasi-judicial secretive body that takes away your natural rights as a Canadian. Section 13 had actually stopped being used as a shield, as I think it was intended to protect civil liberties, and started being used as a sword against Canadians, and it's because it was a poorly written piece of legislation in the first place, he said. And there's more to that. The link is in the description if you want to read it. Fast forward to 2019, where newly minted David Lametti, the Attorney General who took over from Jody Wilson-Raybould after she refused to give SNC-Lavalin a DPA, Deferred Prosecution Agreement, he says, "I'll have a look at it." National Post is reporting, Liberals inching closer to reviving Section 13, the controversial hate speech law repealed in 2013. Justice Minister David Lametti says he will look very carefully at recommendations by a Liberal-dominated House of Commons committee that the government start consultations to revive a controversial hate speech law repealed in 2013 over free speech concerns. It is the latest sign the Liberals are seriously considering bringing back a version of Section 13 of the Canada Human Rights Code, but one updated to target hate speech spread through social media. Section 13 made it a discriminatory practice to convey messages over the phone or internet that contain any matter that is likely to expose a person or persons to hatred or contempt, as long as those people were identifiable on the basis of a prohibited ground of discrimination. Canada already has criminal code provisions that prohibit the incitement of hatred against identifiable groups, the promotion of genocide, and the distribution of hate propaganda. A conviction comes with heavy penalties, including prison time. Given free speech concerns, however, the charges require the sign-off of an Attorney General before being laid. But complaints made under Section 13 were dealt with through the quasi-judicial Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, not the courts. The tribunal could levy fines of up to $10,000 and issue cease and desist orders. Critics of the day, including many Liberals, argued the law was overly broad and had weak safeguards to protect speech rights. Earlier this spring, the Commons Justice Committee began a study into the issue of online hate speech. The report, written by the Liberal majority, was released this week, calls on the government to strike a working group to establish a non-criminal remedy for hate speech violating the Federal Human Rights Code. It is said the remedy should apply irrespective of whether the violation happens online, in person, or in traditional print format. This remedy could take the form of reinstating the former Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, or implementing a provision analogous to the provision Section 13 within the Canadian Human Rights Act, which accounts for the prevalence of hatred on social media, the report said. Speaking on Tuesday after a cabinet meeting, Lametti declined to say whether he personally wants to see Section 13 revived, but pointed out the courts ultimately found it was constitutional and said he'd taken note of suggestions on how the former law could be updated and improved. Yeah, right. As Bernier well knows, I scroll down a little bit, free expression is something that we value in this country, Lametti said in response. He should also know and you can fit anything in there, in the current context with online platforms, that the limits of free speech, justifiable limits of free speech, is something that any government should be looking into, as the Prime Minister did when he was in Paris and looked at the Christchurch Declaration. Right, trash. The government and Mr. Scheer's also getting on the bandwagon of this, of the limits of free speech. They're trying to limit free speech, and really, the people who you least want to define what those limits are, right? What defines hate speech exactly? What is hate speech? Will be the last people you want to define hate speech. And that's what's already happening. I'll leave you with this. I'm just going to show you about a minute, maybe 40 seconds. This is a terrible pause face, but I think it's an important one. Not the pause face, the important minute. This is the problems with not being able to offend people and have a hard conversation. You have to. If you want to actually move the needle on something, you have to be willing to offend people. And, well, it's unfortunate, but it's true. Here we go.
Is being sensitive to offence such a problem, though? Like, we would have previously called that manners.
It's a terrible problem. So imagine you, okay, so the rule is you can't offend anyone, all right? Let's say you're speaking to one person, I can't offend you. All right, fair enough. What if I'm speaking to 10 people? Do I get to offend 1 in 10? How about 1 in 100? How about 1 in 1,000? You're going to come out on stage and you're going to say something important about something vital, and you're not going to offend 1 person in 1,000? Well, you can't say anything about anything important ever without offending probably the person you're talking to. Important speech about important issues, especially contentious issues, is instantly offensive.
But there are ways that you can share, I guess, provocative views where you attempt to still do that with an air of, say, respectfulness, where you're trying to mitigate against the offensiveness.
This is true, yeah. You can actually try listening when you're having a conversation, right? Assuming that both people who are having the conversation are of goodwill, and they're not trying to play tricks, and they're struggling towards the truth, which neither of them hold completely, and both understand that. Yeah, you can.
And that's part of the problem, right? It seems like the weaponization of offense has happened, right? If I'm offended, you have injured me greatly, and so you need to stop your speech because it is continuing to injure me. It's an interesting place to be, and I don't like where we are, and I think we need some drastic changes. And this video is too long to upload to my regular local channel, so I'm gonna have to figure out a solution to that. My name is Mark for all of us. That rhymes with for all of us, and I am the candidate for the People's Party for the Guelph riding. I hope you vote for me. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.